People who have gone to summer camp as a child, what was your creepy, scary experience? My youth group stayed at a campsite for a weekend trip. We were all in the cabin playing card games when someone with a gorilla suit ran by the cabin and started banging on the door. It really freaked everyone out because it was no one in our group. They came back a couple times until one of the adults confronted the person and they ran away. They never found out who the person was. I went to Girl Scout camp when I was around 8 years old. So around 2001, all the counselors were young 20-year-olds. There was a girl in my group who did something to piss off the counselors. I don't remember what, but I know it was minor. It was the middle of summer and super hot, and she was moderately overweight. They made her sit in the sun and wouldn't allow her to have any water as punishment. They were terrible people, made me super afraid of them as a kid. I remember a friend going off on camp administration for something similar. Her daughter got in some trouble with junior counselors, something really minor, possibly staying too long on phone with mother or something like that. They didn't report it as they were supposed to, but made her stand by stinky trash pit, or broken sewer, in hot weather for 2 hours. My friend went to that camp since childhood, first as kid, then as junior counselor, then as senior. So she definitely was pissed off at them. Went on a camping trip. I was one of the first ones out of the bus and had to use the public bathroom. I notice a few daddy long legs on the wall outside the bathroom and think nothing of it. I opened the door and am immediately greeted by thousands if not millions of daddy long legs that are covering the bathroom from top to bottom. The bathroom was big as well, like 3 stalls and 3 urinals. That, and coupled with the fact that our camp counselors were sadistic and told us preteens a bunch of scary stories, then jumped out of the woods in the middle of the night screaming with bloody Jason masks. I stayed in my tent most of the time after that. Stayed at a week-long camp in the early 80s. Our cabins were a mix of old lumber, built in the 40s or 50s, and new cinder block from the 70s. A series of storms hit one night and my old cabin was shaking like a ship at sea. A camp director banged on our door and told us to grab a sleeping bag, a pillow, a jacket and our shoes, and we hiked, mostly in the dark, to the rec center basement. Tornado sirens were blaring and we could hear, but not see, trees crashing in the woods around us. We made it and hunkered down through the storms, but that walk was the longest half-mile of my life. We were playing soccer and someone shattered my leg, broke it in 8 places. There was no swelling, so they said I was faking it and they wouldn't take me to the hospital. They sent me back to my cabin for the night. I hopped around for a day, but the next night I was in too much pain to sleep, so I limped to the nurse's office, broke in and took a handful of Benadryl just so I could sleep. That night, a group was doing an overnight in a 3-sided shelter and decided to have a peanut butter fight before bed. One kid fell asleep with peanut butter in his hair and woke up when a skunk walked into the shelter and pulled a piece of his scalp out. The kid punted the skunk out of the shelter, which caused it to spray everyone on the overnight. So they had to take the kid for rabies shots, so they might as well take me along to get x-rays since they were going anyway. Helen Keller could have pointed out the breaks on my x-rays. As a 13-year-old kid, I went out into the woods at like 1 a.m. with a headlamp to pee, just immediately behind my cabin, because I didn't want to walk to the wash house. While I'm peeing, I look forward and see a large bear, just staring at me. Would have pissed myself if not for the fact that I was already peeing. Either way, I just finished my stream while he stared at me, and walked backwards back to the cabin. He turned around and walked away, but there was no chance in hell that I would turn my back on a bear and run the other way. I was about to come here with basically the same story, except there were 3 coyotes just hanging out right outside the cabin. I didn't even notice them until I was done peeing because I was in a sleepy daze. Also, there was a giant wolf spider that was covered in babies in one of the girls' beds and she woke up to it. This is probably more of a horror story to most. My comp counselor thought it'd be a good idea to take a group of 11-year-olds out of the warm cabin we were sleeping in and instead sleep overnight on the outdoor stage they use for comp plays. It must have been 10 degrees out. I was so cold. It was unbearable. I couldn't conserve any body heat. BC I had a stick for a body and my sleeping bag wasn't made for that type of camping. I remember being tense and scrunched up in a ball. Every movement I made was like dipping my legs in ice. The outside of my sleeping bag was wet and cold from condensation, which made it worse. Eventually we walked back at 4 a.m. BC all the kids couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't creepy, but it was scary to be so cold and tired in the dark. I still remember it. This was early 90s at a school camp. I got up during the night to go to the camp toilet. It wasn't far away. I could see it from our tent. There wasn't anybody around. On my way back, I spotted a man I didn't recognize shining a torch into the side of the boys' tent to make shadows appear. When he saw me approach, he put his torch away and walked away, but was sort of hovering around the campsite. I thought he was campsite security and that I was going to get into trouble for leaving my tent during the night, and as I was an anxious kid, it kept me up all night. As I couldn't sleep, I noticed for a good hour or so that the guy was still walking around and shining his torch into the side of tents. I could hear him and see the light. In the morning, I was falling asleep at breakfast and my friends were taking the piss about it. One of the teachers noticed and thought I was getting sick, so she came over to ask if I was alright, and I said I had been up all night because of the camp security guard shining his torch into tents. She looked horrified and said, "What camp security?" and went off to tell one of the male teachers. It turned out that the campsite didn't have security and the police were called out. Some guy who was known to the area for being a sex offender had recently been released from prison and was living in the nearby forest in a tent. I was young, like 11 to 12 octoseconds old, and at Girl Scout camp. One night, after lights out, we were told by our counselors to stay in the cabins, latch the doors, get under the beds and turn out all lights. Some old guy had gotten drunk and trespassed. He had been walking around the property but luckily didn't find any of the campgrounds. Rumors were he had an axe, but I don't think that's true. I was on a canoeing trip. It was a trip that had been done by this camp for 10-20 years. Same canoeing portion of a pretty well-known river. Every year on the first day of the canoe trip, kids and staff members would jump off this rock on the edge of the river. It was probably 20 feet up in the air, estimating, but the water was deep, probably 10-12 feet of water. This group of kids asked to make the jump, just as thousands of kids had done before. We tested the jump by having the tallest staff member jump off the cliff. He safely did so, just as always. So then the kids went and did the same. Several kids jumped, came up and were all fine. Then one kid jumps, comes up and says, "I think I cut my knee." Everyone laughed, but then this kid said, "No, seriously, come look." There was a giant chunk of the fat around his knee missing. If the injury had been elsewhere, it would be pumping blood out. It could have been much worse, but the kid was fine. He went to the hospital and got 12 or so stitches. He didn't rejoin the trip, but he went back and stayed the 2 weeks at camp. Needless to say, no kid ever jumped off that giant rock again. From our camp, I was about 12 and I was at sleepaway camp, and the counselors took us on a hike into the woods for a night. When it came time to go to bed, of course none of us were actually falling asleep, and we overheard the counselors talking about the police looking for someone. We later learned one of the kids was in the middle of a serious custody battle and that the dad was planning on taking the kid, and that the reason we were in the woods was so that he wouldn't find us at the cabin. No idea if it was actually dangerous, but looking back it definitely is unsettling. I was actually going to comment on this thread because at 9 I was the kid in a scenario just like that. My father's second wife asked for a divorce, so he took their son and fucked off to Mexico without telling anyone. He had taken me out to dinner with them the night before but dropped me off at home after, which my mother credits with her having told him in no uncertain terms. Years prior, that if he ever did anything to cause me harm she would hunt him down and kill him in an excruciating way. Knowing the woman, I 100% believe her, and so did he. So the same day he took off, my mom dropped me off at a large sleepaway Girl Scout camp that runs week-long camp programs for about 100 girls a week. By the next day, when it was clear my dad had kidnapped his son, there were cops at the camp. But they knew that if he was going to try to take me, he'd do it by picking me up as a parent rather than wander through the woods to take me in the night. My mom wanted to take me home, but they basically convinced her to leave me at the camp as bait by assuring her they'd have officers stationed throughout. So on my end the week proceeded as normal and I didn't notice anything different. When I came to get picked up, my mom came to my campsite in a golf cart with two men who worked for the camp that I didn't recognize. But that was the only off thing I remember. In reality, those two officers and a few more stayed at the camp all week in case he showed up. There was a helicopter hovering over the grounds the whole last day. Went to a Boy Scout summer camp in the mid-late 90s. They had an archery range where we all were learning how to shoot. They were big on safety, but it was the 90s, so anyways everyone shoots. And we are downrange getting our arrows, then we hear someone yell out in the covered shooting area. I look up and see the semi-special needs kid holding an arrow at full draw and lets go. Hits the kid standing 5 feet from me in the arm. It's chaos, everyone's running around and screaming. The kid with an arrow stick out of him is just standing there in shock. Next year there was no more archery training. I'm sure this is going to get downvoted. But as someone who's attended and worked at summer camps, sometimes shower duty is necessary. Kids are lazy and they can be cruel, so you have to make sure that they shower at all, and b, that they aren't tormenting some other poor kid in there, towel snapping, putting soap in their eyes, making fun of their bodies, etc. I guess camps make it policy because parents get upset if they come pick up their kids and they smell like hobos. Also, usually no adult is ever alone with the children, meaning if some malfeasance did happen it would be instantly seen and reported. During scout camp I had a tree branch fall on my head. I was under a tree when I heard a cracking noises above me. I could tell it wasn't safe, so I attempted to move somewhere safer. And I guess the universe had it out for me because I only made it about 4 feet before the branch landed squarely on my head. Luckily it wasn't that big and was soft from being rotten, so it didn't cause any major damage. Did hurt like heck though and put me in a lot of shock. We were on this really long canoe trip in northern Ontario, like up wilderness. We were on this gorgeous clear lake when we found a secluded beach. It was really beautiful, so we decided to stay there for the night. The whole day and even sitting around the fire that night felt weird, but I couldn't really place my finger on it. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft country music. None of us had a stereo, so I stuck my head out of the tent to see WTF was up. There was a bald guy going through our campsite picking up stuff as he went along. We made eye contact and he put a finger to his lips and made a SHHHH sound, so I hid in my sleeping bag. Lol. I can't remember what he took, but it wasn't much. Turns out there is a pretty significant hermit population in northern Ontario. 10 years old. Summer camp in the mountains. One of the big events of the week was an overnight hike up the mountain, which I was already dreading because of my asthma, and when we got up there, instead of tents we slept in a tarp that had been set up to cover the ground, up and then over us, meaning our feet were pointing out into the forest. I woke up halfway thought the night to snuffling sounds and heavy footsteps, then something bumped my feet, which were sticking out a little farther than the rest of the group. I froze up and waited for what I'm almost 100% convinced was a bear lose interest and move on, but I never went back to that camp for summer camp again. I was in a summer camp on an island when I was 13 and we were hanging out at the beach during dawn. All of a sudden a woman came out of nowhere and walked with big steps towards the water. She had been wearing a white cape, which she threw dramatically away. Underneath she was completely naked. When she reached the water she walked into it, despite it being not very warm, until she started to swim, always straight ahead away from the island until we lost track of her. We stayed for 1,5 more hours, but she never came back, and it was dark and she was naked and her cape was still at the beach. Back then we joked that she was a mermaid, but it later occurred to me that we may have witnessed a suicide. Other scary stuff was me meeting a fox in the middle of the night while going to the toilet, and a girl trying to kill herself and bleeding all over the place. If the trip to the campsite counts, we also had 2 boys being killed by a truck that fell on them. I went to a lot of summer camps, by the way. Edit. Okay, I maybe should also tell the story about the 2 boys, since that actually traumatized me more. I would always drive with the same organization from age 7-18. Since I was 16 as a supervisor. Because of that, it's also not surprising that so much stuff happened, I guess. We would always drive together as a group in buses to get to different campsites. Now this campsite was in Hungary and I'm from Germany, so it was a really long ride and we drove overnight. Around 1 in the morning we made a stop at a gas station on the highway. I was 11 years old and back together with my summer camp friends and very awake. We went to the toilet and the shop and the gas station and were giggly and happy. I remember that we heard a very loud sound, like a big metal bar falling down. I even remember laughing about it for some reason. We went back to the bus thinking nothing about it. After half an hour of nothing happening, we started to realize something was wrong. A story would go around about a truck falling on a boy and that he came out of a little wood that separated the highway from the gas station full of blood. Also 2 other boys were missing. I knew one of them from earlier camps. We were not allowed to leave the bus. An ambulance was actually called. I think we waited there till early in the morning, 5-6 o'clock. The police was there and everything, and we saw them working from the bus. Then the boy came back. Not one of the 2 missing, but the one that said a truck fell on him. He had been in the hospital to get stitches and now he wanted to continue the drive. He indeed was full of blood. They drove us to a community center then, and when we got there we all were gathered and told that the 2 boys indeed were dead. They got too close to the highway behind the woods, and just at that moment the truck that transported car parts lost control and fell on them. They got us people there for psychological support and we had a place to sleep and they put on movies, etc. It was weird. It was in the news, etc. And I remember informing my parents that me and my brother were alive and well. We actually drove to Hungary after a day at the community center, because most children still wanted to go, even the cousin of the boy that died and the boy that survived. And some children literally couldn't go anywhere else. If you didn't want to go, you also had the opportunity to drive back home. I went and it was actually a good summer camp because all the people there were going through the same thing. We had psychologists on the campsite. Writing this, I realized that it still traumatized me more than I thought. Long-time camper plus staff member here. One of the summers I was on the leadership/directors team, we were all woken up to the strangest muffled shuffling, static sound over our walkie-talkies. It was about 3 a.m. when it first came through, and it would happen again every hour or so. At around 7 a.m. the weird static starts again, and then all of a sudden a woman's voice screaming cuts through. During all 15 of us awake in our respective bunks all across camp. It wasn't until the next session that the camp owner found out and told us what it was. Turns out one of the neighbors of the property worked at Walmart and their walkies operated at the same frequency as ours. He had fallen asleep on the couch with it on his hip after a late shift, and he would roll onto the speak button. It was random coincidence his wife managed to stub her toe right as he was rolling back onto the talk button. We had a good laugh and would sometimes imitate her scream when we were not on the main channel. During the summers I would spend a month or so visiting family in Michigan. Some of my cousins my age would go to a camp in the up called Hiawatha. The cabins we got assigned for the week had about 6 campers and 2 counselors and were spaced far apart from each other deep in the woods away from in common area. There were stories about a father and son that were hunting near the campgrounds during the off-season. The story went that the father thought he saw a big buck and took a shot at it only to get to the deer and find out he shot his son in the neck. Being so deep in the woods and such a fatal shot, he shot his son in the head to stop the pain. The game and wildlife agents that found them said the father suffered an apparent gunshot wound through the roof of his mouth or of his head in what looked like a murder. suicide. The counselors always felt it necessary to tell the story to the younger, new campers. Now, I don't know if hearing the story and the atmosphere of cabins being so far from the common areas and deep in the woods caused me to see things. But a friend I was walking from the cabins to the mess hall with early one morning, before the breakfast bell. We saw what looked like a father and son dressed like they were hunting, carrying shotguns, walking towards our cabin. Ours was almost second from being the farthest from anything. We took off so fast, sprinting through the trees, and once we hit the open field between the cabins and the mess hall, we saw another group of guys running out behind us. We were shocked to see anyone else before the bell rang, and running no less. We asked why they were running too. They looked back from the direction they came, turned back to us and said, "We saw a hunter pointing a shotgun at us."